and the Donatists were declared heretics. When the Donatists continued to pester the emperor about the issue, though, Constantine finally lost his temper. He had been at the council, though he sat as a layperson, and saw nothing untoward about the process. The Donatists had had their day in court, and they had lost. It was time to get over it, drop their complaints, and get on board with the program. Which brings us to the last 2 points I want to make about the whole affair. First, it gives us an initial glimpse at what Constantine's religious priorities really were. Specifically, how much weight he put in the idea of unity. As we go forward, we will see again and again that Constantine liked Christianity, supported Christianity, and believed in Christianity, but that it drove him crazy how much Christians fought with each other. Constantine didn't care what wound up orthodoxy and what wound up heresy, though there is good reason to believe he actually supported the anti-Donatist position, just as long as everyone agreed what was what. He seemed genuinely afraid that discord within the church imperiled all their souls. This fear would culminate with the Council of Nicaea, when Constantine pushed for all doctrinal disputes to be settled once and for all. This fear would also lead to the second point I want to make. Now that Donatism had been given a fair hearing and still been declared heretical, it was time for it to be purged from the system in order to maintain all-important unity and purity of the church. So following the Council of Arles, we see Constantine nodding in approval as the first instances of Christian-on-Christian violence begin to break out in North Africa. And then, when the Donatists persisted, we see him threatening to come down there himself and show everyone how it was done. But he wouldn't get the chance, as war with Licinius interrupted his dabbling, for now, in the controversies of the church. After he left Arles in the late summer of 314, Constantine returned to Trier to keep an eye on the Rhine frontier, and Licinius returned from the east to keep an eye on the Danube frontier. At some point after the first of the year, though we really don't know when, a subtle new wrinkle in the balance of power was introduced, as Constantia gave birth to Licinius's first child, a son who we'll call Licinius the Younger. Though the baby Licinius was just that, a baby, most historians believe that Constantine immediately detected a threat to his long-term dynastic ambitions, so the Western Emperor set in motion a series of events that would eventually lead first to murder and then to war. Though over the course of the last few years the Tetrarchy as an institution had withered, as no replacement candidates had been elevated to replace Galerius or Maximinus Daia, at some point in 315, Constantine suddenly proposed resurrecting the idea of junior imperial colleagues. Specifically, he sent a message to Licinius suggesting a man named Bassianus be elevated to the rank of Caesar. Additional Caesar does not a tetrarchy make, which is why scholars suppose that in addition to the documented proposal to elevate Bassianus, that Constantine further intended to elevate his son Crispus at the same time. Though we have no proof of it, the supposition makes sense on its own merits, and conveniently fits with Constantine's general political posture during the period. Crispus had been born sometime between 299 and 305, while Constantine was in the east at Diocletian's court, and his story mirrors that of his father. He was the son of Constantine and a woman named Minervina, whose relationship with Constantine, like that of Constantine's own mother Helena with his father Constantius, is a bit murky. Minervina may have been an informal mistress, she may have been a legal wife who was divorced to make way for Fausta, or she may have been a legal wife who died before 307. Like Constantine himself then, by 315 AD, Crispus stood as the son of a previous marriage who was very possibly illegitimate. But perhaps drawing from his own experience, Constantine never wavered in his recognition of Crispus, and always acknowledged and supported the boy as his rightful heir, as we are seeing right now in his attempt to make a Caesar of the boy/teenager. The presumption here is that Constantine was looking to overwhelm any claim to power the baby Licinius might put forward someday, by packing a revived tetrarchy with his own people. Bassianus, you see, was not just a respected senator, he was also Constantine's brother-in-law. But Constantine didn't want to be too obvious in his dynastic maneuverings, which is why, of all his possible male relations, the Western Augustus specifically nominated Bassianus, because Bassianus's brother was a man named Senecio, who was a close friend of Licinius. Hopefully, Licinius would agree to the proposal, believing that he was getting a Caesar he could trust, and thus accept a tetrarchy essentially composed of Constantine's extended family. And if you count Licinius, who was himself Constantine's brother-in-law, then you could say that the whole tetrarchy would be composed of Constantine's extended family. But the Eastern Augustus was not buying what Constantine was selling. According to Constantine's later version of events, it was a good thing for him that Licinius shot down Bassianus' nomination, because as it turned out, the would-be Caesar was not nearly as loyal to Constantine as the Western Augustus had supposed. According to Constantine's later story, not long after refusing the proposal to renew the Tetrarchy, Licinius had actually talked his friend Senecio into talking his brother Bassianus into initiating a plot to kill Constantine, and that Bassianus had agreed to the plan. No one really believes today that Bassianus was actually involved in a conspiracy against his brother-in-law, but over the winter of 315-316, Constantine's agents allegedly caught Bassianus red-handed, and the would-be assassin was executed. So, if there was no plot, why did Constantine suddenly turn on the man he had been ready to make Caesar just the year before? The answer appears to lie in the fact that after 8 years of marriage, Fausta was finally pregnant. With another heir on the way, and of course the child would be a boy, Bassianus became expendable, so Constantine used him as a convenient conduit through which to accuse Licinius of murderous treachery. After Fausta gave birth to Constantine's second son, of course it was a son, the ill-fated Constantine II, Constantine I stepped up his rhetoric and demanded that Licinius hand over Senecio so that he too could be tried for attempted regicide. But Licinius refused to hand over his old friend, and diplomatic relations between the two emperors broke down. In the fall of 316, Constantine, convenient pretext for war now in hand, led a force of about 20,000 over the Alps and into Illyria to confront Licinius. Hearing that his brother emperor was on the march, Licinius mustered 35,000 troops and marched west, ready to do some confronting of his own. The two emperors met on October the 8th, 316 AD on an open plain near the Pannonian city of Cibali, and after some brief skirmishing, the two infantries got down to business. Both emperors were no doubt hoping that this would prove to be their final battle for control of the Roman Empire, but both were disappointed. After a slugfest that lasted all day, Constantine finally led a cavalry charge right before sundown that decisively routed Licinius' army. But the breakthrough came too late in the day, and darkness ended hostilities before Constantine could finish the job. Under the cover of night, Licinius gathered up what was left of his army and drove them first north to Sirmium and then east to Adrianople to regroup. It seems that it was at this point, just after the Battle of Cibali, that Licinius elevated one of his generals, a man named Aurelius Valerius Valens, to the rank of full co-Augustus. Valens had been serving as the theater commander of the Danube frontier, and it appears that with his legitimacy badly shaken by Constantine's victory, that Licinius wanted to secure the loyalty of Valens before the general defected to Constantine's side. The now co-emperors based in Adrianople then quickly raised a new army, and at some point during the winter of 316-317, the peace talks that had been ongoing since Cibali broke down and the armies of East and West met again, this time at the Thracian town of Mardia. Both emperors hoped that this would be their final battle, but alas, again, it was not. Like the Battle of Cibali, the Battle of Mardia was an extremely hard-fought affair that once again saw Constantine get the upper hand, but once again saw night fall before he could finish the job. Then, once again, Licinius and Valens gathered up their battered army and retreated under the cover of night. But they were not running scared, and their line of retreat led the so far perfect golden boy Constantine to finally make a mistake. The most obvious fallback position for Licinius's army at this point was Byzantium, and this was so obvious that Constantine just assumed that that's where his rival Augustus was headed. More than ready to end this thing, Constantine plunged to fully solidify his defenses. But Licinius and Valens had not in fact headed to Byzantium. Guessing that this is what Constantine was guessing that they'd do, they instead withdrew north into the hills. Once Constantine blew past their position, they dropped back down and neatly cut off his supply and communication lines to the west. It did not take long for Constantine to realize his mistake. Both sides stalled for time, as Licinius and Valens waited for Constantine to recognize how dire his position was, and as Constantine waited to see if his porters could somehow slip through the enemy blockade. As soon as a much-needed shipment of supplies was captured, though, Constantine threw in the towel and came to the table. On March the 1st, 316 AD, the two sides came together and hammered out a peace. Now, Constantine was in a tight spot, but he had still whipped Licinius twice in a row, so it's not like he was negotiating with a gun to his head. He knew that Licinius wanted this over even more than he did, which is why Constantine was able to negotiate such a favorable settlement for himself. In fact, his only real concession to Licinius was that the Eastern Augustus would not be deposed just yet. Other than that, though, Constantine dictated the terms, and Licinius accepted them. First, the Eastern Augustus would unequivocally recognize the Western Augustus as the senior Augustus. Up until now, it had been a little unclear who outranked who. Constantine had had himself declared Maximum Augustus by the Senate, but there was no getting around the fact that Licinius had been Augustus longer, and so enjoyed a natural seniority. Now the issue was put to bed. Constantine was the top dog. Second, all the territory west of Thrace was ceded to Constantine, giving him control over Greece, which was nice, but more importantly, giving him control over all the legions stationed along the Danube. Finally, there was the small matter of Valens. Nowhere in Constantine's dynastic plans was there room for some random general inserted into the imperial college without his approval. Valens was to be deposed and executed. Licinius agreed to everything, and Valens, who had enjoyed the novelty of calling himself Augustus for maybe 3 or 4 months, was stripped of his rank and killed. The last little bit of business to attend to was to finally address the long-term future of the imperial dynasty. Constantine had tried to restart the Tetrarchy on his own terms, and Licinius had tried to elevate a new emperor on his own terms. So now both men agreed to a simple compromise that would hopefully settle things. Crispus, Constantine II, and Licinius the Younger would all be elevated to the rank of Caesar. Now, since Crispus was at most 17 years old, and possibly as young as 11, and Constantine II and Licinius the Younger were both babies, this compromise does not represent a return to the Tetrarchy, so much as it harkens back to the old days, when a Roman emperor would give his son the title Caesar, to signal that he was the official heir to the throne. Though the idea of the Tetrarchy was not entirely done for yet, as evidenced by the fact that when Licinius and Constantine next went to war, each was supported by a Caesar, clearly, the Tetrarchy is about to be relegated to the dustbin of history. The peace would hold for the next 7 years, though clearly neither emperor thought it would last forever,